Hello everyone, I'm Viviana, and today I bring up the topic of ethnolinguistic variation, focusing on how Spanish as a first language and English as a second language differences influencing academic discourse. Let's have an introduction. What if people could translate any language in the world into another just literally? It couldn't make sense. There couldn't be room for unique language, culture, and beliefs. And so what constructs an individual as a whole? They're going to exist then the ethnolinguistic variation, which refers to how language is shaped by the cultural and ethnic background of a group, highlighting a specific linguistic features like vocabulary, pronunciation, or communication styles. In academic discourse, which is a way of talking and writing that follows academic rules, these variations can be found in language structure, cultural norms, pragmatics, and discourse styles that I will further dig deeply. In other words, the rhetorical conventions. Let's unpack the topic. Ethnolinguistic variation research area of language for specific purposes has its foundational work on contrastive rhetoric, that studies how a person's native language and culture influence the writing in a second language, and intercultural rhetoric, that analyzes written communication involving people from diverse cultural backgrounds. Spanish and English differ significantly, which affects second language learners' coherence, logic, and audience expectations in academic writing and professional contexts. Some native Spanish speakers offer transfer rhetorical norms such as argumentation, high formality, and respect for authority, which may not adjust with English academic conventions. A little bit of background. One of the major clusters identified by Liu and Hu analysis of English for specific purposes research is ethnolinguistic variation in academic discourse. In written discourse, we find alternative methods that establish a shared foundation for constructing meaning together. Hu and Wang investigated the influence of disciplinary and ethno-linguistic backgrounds. Their findings show that scholars who are native Spanish speakers frequently use citations to assert authority and show their involvement with previous research, reflecting a rhetorical approach that emphasizes credibility and personal presence. On the other hand, native English speaker scholars are more likely to use citations to back up their arguments. To maintain objectivity consistent with the Anglo-American academic style that prioritizes detached, evidence-focused writing. Let's see now some arguments and theories research-based. Before looking at the grounded theory, we will first see the concept of discourse community. That refers to a group of people who identify their way of using language as distinct from other groups. For instance, English for Science and its non-English academic scientists community are top research within the field, and to start my examples, I'll say that Liu and Hu found that the discourse community of senior Spanish academics perceive competence in English as a prerequisite for full participation in a globalized and highly competitive academic world, and this made them feel unfairly suffering in greater disadvantage to Anglophone academics, where academic English use was seen as extremely complex, especially when speaking. On the contrary, Moren pointed out that academic discourses in themselves have no native speakers. They are learned in secondary socialization by all participants in academic communities of practice. And these positions was shared as well by Highland in a polemic article which contended that the assumption of linguistic injustice against EAL academics was a myth. These arguments created controversy and tensions, emphasizing that the dominance of English as a principal medium of communication can impact significantly in the lives of the non-Anglophone academics. But I'd say, if academic discourse doesn't have native speakers, why the discourses are not delivered in Spanish, for example, Chinese, or Japanese by all participants when the scientists and research comes from such backgrounds? Why does it need to be translated into English? Let's see more arguments. In a PhD thesis from Soler Montreal, she found that Spanish speakers have a lack of a critical stance when compared with their English counterparts. And another study of Hunter and Englander says that Mexican scientists have 24% greater burden of writing academic articles in English as a second language than in their first language. And also, Moreno, in her intercultural rhetoric approach research, found that Spanish scientists fail to articulate clearly the contributions of their study, which creates writing obstacles in English and makes the authors to revise their manuscript several times to comply with the expectations of the scientific journals. These same burdens were found in other disciplines, for example, legal English, that is more analytical, emphasized on precise language and structured argumentation, which also contrasts with the more rhetorical and emotive traditions in Spanish legal writing. And some of the conclusions are specifically this: Spanish is more flexible and authoritative and uses less hedging language like might, could, and would. Let's see some of the LSP teaching now. For example, for educators that have some responsibility, for example, raising an awareness on their learners, understanding how spoken and written communication impacts an audience, help the students to understand why English for academic writing emphasizes clarity, stance, and directness, and also can use a constructive rhetoric awareness that compares and reflects on differences between Spanish and English academic norms. They also need to teach how academic discourse varies between disciplines like science and medicine and law. And they must address the ethno-linguistic rhetorical transfer and not only focus on grammar and vocabulary. Also, the institutions should develop a specialized curriculum addressing these differences in whichever language background, which theory and practice. Okay, so the constructive rhetoric in LSP teaching is specific rhetoric patterns of a cultural that alter the writing of English learners in a negative way. For example, Kaplan says that English, in addition as a national language, students should be taught to write essays following the Anglo-American academic style, which characterized by the clear and direct progression of ideas. And the research related to the topic says, for example, or mentions the critical discourse studies. That refers to how power, inequality, and ideology in a society influence the written discourse among second language users, and the corpus linguistics that analyzes how first language patterns influence in English academic writing through large collections of real-world texts. Let's see now finally the conclusions. Diverse theories through time have demonstrated through comprehensive studies and research the reasons of the lack of effectiveness in second language use in academic discourse of select group of people, for example, scientists, giving light to how their second language skills make them feel, creating controversy and tensions among scientists and research in the field. But who is right or wrong? Perhaps in this occasion I can't be neutral, as I'm a Spanish native speaker and I may have a say, agreeing how difficult it is to communicate critically and academically in a second language, especially when you have always lived in your home country. Thank you for your listening, and it was a pleasure to present this topic to you. Have a good day.